The biting Chicago snow swirled outside, a furious white blur against the frosted panes of Diana Mercer's little flower shop. Inside, the air was warmer, heavy with the scent of damp earth and blossoming life, a fragile shield against the harsh winter world. Diana, at 22, moved with a quiet grace among the blooms, her fingers usually nimble and sure, trembling slightly as she arranged a bouquet of white lilies. Each petal, pristine and untouched, seemed to mock the growing despair in her own heart. Her father's gambling debts were no longer a whispered secret, but a suffocating shadow, tightening its hold around her every day. She had overheard hushed phone calls, fragments of panicked pleas, and then the chilling silence that followed. Her dreams, once as vibrant as the spring tulips she nurtured, now felt like wilting petals, fading under the weight of an unseen threat. She longed for a tiny lakeside shop of her own, a quiet haven where she could simply create beauty, far from the chaotic life her father had built. A life without fear was all she ever truly yearned for. Her gaze drifted to the worn wooden counter, where a single folded sheet of paper lay tucked beneath a clay pot. It wasn't just paper, it was a blood-speckled IOU note, a tangible symbol of her impending doom. A drop of her own blood from a thorn prick a week ago had fallen onto it, staining the stark white with an ominous crimson. She touched it with a hesitant finger, the rough texture a physical reminder of the impossible debt her father owed. He had promised her it would be fine, that he would handle it, but the increasing desperation in his voice told a different story. Diana felt the knot of dread in her stomach tighten. The men her father dealt with weren't like the kindly old ladies who bought her roses. Their names were whispered in hushed tones, synonymous with fear. She didn't understand their world, a brutal place of shadowy deals and unspoken threats, and the thought of being dragged into it made her breath catch in her throat. She imagined herself a delicate bloom, torn from its roots, exposed to a killing frost. The cold outside seeped into her bones, even inside the relative warmth of the shop. Every gust of wind rattling the windows sounded like a warning, every distant siren a precursor to the inevitable. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than the blizzard, that her father was out of options. And when he ran out of options, he always looked for something or someone else to pay. A shiver ran down her spine, unrelated to the cold. She squeezed her eyes shut, picturing her small, fragile hopes dissolving like snowflakes on warm glass. The lilies in her hands felt impossibly heavy, a beautiful burden in a world that was about to shatter her into a million pieces. Her innocence was palpable, her desperation a silent scream, echoing only within the confines of her own terrified heart. The biting wind howled through the gaps in the corrugated metal, rattling the desolate warehouse like a hungry beast. Diana shivered, her thin coat offering little defense against the pervasive cold that seeped into her bones. Her father, agitated and trembling, had practically dragged her here, his frantic whispers about a meeting and settling things, doing little to calm her escalating terror. She clutched her small handbag, its strap digging into her palm, a desperate anchor in a world that felt suddenly unmoored. Shadowy figures emerged from the gloom, their faces obscured by the dim, flickering bulb overhead. 3 men, bulky and menacing, surrounded them. Their eyes, even in the poor light, seemed to dissect her, assessing her like a piece of merchandise. A wave of nausea washed over Diana. These were not the men her father usually owed money to. These were something far worse. She understood, with a sickening lurch of her stomach, that she was the payment. Her father, desperate and broken, had sold her. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and stinging, but she dared not let them fall. She felt utterly helpless, a fragile bloom caught in a storm, about to be torn apart. Just as one of the men reached out a hand, a low, resonant voice cut through the tense silence, sharp as a blade. "The deal is off." Diana flinched, her gaze snapping towards the source of the sound. He emerged from the deepest shadows, a figure so imposing he seemed to absorb the light around him. Cole Thorne. His name was a legend whispered in fear, a chill that had nothing to do with the warehouse's cold. He was taller than any man she had ever seen, broad-shouldered, his presence radiating an aura of lethal power that made the air crackle. His eyes, dark and unreadable, swept over the traffickers, then settled on Diana for a terrifying, all-encompassing moment. She felt utterly exposed, as if he could see every fear, every desperate hope cowering within her. The traffickers, moments ago so confident, now seemed to shrink under his unyielding gaze. Their predatory smiles vanished, replaced by wary tension. Cole didn't raise his voice, yet every word he spoke resonated with absolute command. "She belongs to me now." He didn't negotiate, he didn't explain, he simply stated. With a flick of his wrist, a thick stack of bills, far more than her father's debt, landed on a grimy table with a soft thud. It was a king's ransom, a brutal display of wealth and power. Then, from an inner pocket, he produced a small, dark ink pad. He snatched the blood-speckled IOU note from her father's trembling hand, ignoring the man's whimper of protest. Diana watched, mesmerized and horrified. As Cole Thorne pressed his thumb firmly onto the ink, then slammed it down onto the paper, right over her own dried bloodstain. It was a crude, undeniable mark of ownership, a brutal, possessive brand on her very existence. "Anyone who touches what's mine," Cole's voice was low, dangerously calm, "will die screaming." The threat hung heavy in the air, a promise of unimaginable violence. The traffickers, pale and defeated, backed away, their bravado completely evaporated. Diana felt a strange, dizzying mix of terror and an odd, unsettling sense of relief. The men who had intended to take her were gone, their threat neutralized by this larger, more terrifying force. She was no longer chattel for them, she was chattel for him. Cole turned, his dark eyes fixing on her once more. "Come." It wasn't a request, it was an order, simple and absolute. Without a word, two of his silent, dangerous men appeared, flanking her. They didn't touch her, but their presence guided her, propelled her forward. She stumbled, her legs suddenly weak, but she obeyed, her body moving on its own accord. She was whisked away, out of the desolate warehouse into the biting wind, towards a waiting black car. Her world had shattered, not into the million pieces she had feared, but into a new, terrifying whole. She was no longer Diana Mercer, florist, but a possession, claimed by the city's cruelest mafia lord. Her life, irrevocably redefined, had just begun. The black car, silent and luxurious, moved like a predator through the snow-laden streets. Far from the desolate warehouse, Diana sat stiffly, her eyes fixed on the blur of the city outside, a frantic attempt to cling to the familiar world she was being torn from. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a shrinking cage. Her captor, Cole Thorne, sat opposite her, an impassive monument of power, his presence filling the enclosed space, leaving no room for breath or thought. She felt his gaze, a heavy weight, though she dared not meet his eyes. The city lights gave way to darker, tree-lined roads. Then, through a break in the swirling snow, it appeared, a colossal structure of dark, ancient stone. Silhouetted against the bruised twilight sky, Thorne's mansion, it loomed over the frozen river, a fortress of stark grandeur, its windows glowing with a cold, golden light. An iron gate, bearing a menacing, unfamiliar crest, swung open silently at their approach, swallowing the car whole. Inside, the opulence was breathtaking, suffocating. Polished marble floors stretched out like frozen lakes, reflecting the gleam of crystal chandeliers. Heavy tapestries, depicting scenes of forgotten battles, adorned the high walls, soaking up sound, creating an oppressive quiet. Diana's delicate florist's hands, accustomed to the rough earth and soft petals, felt utterly out of place, clumsy and small in this vast, impersonal space. Every turn revealed another watchful figure, men in dark suits, silent, unsmiling, their eyes sharp and assessing. They were guards, not servants, a stark reminder that this wasn't a home, but a gilded prison. Colethorne moved through his domain with an effortless authority, every step a statement of ownership. He didn't need to speak loudly, his presence was command enough. He led her through an endless corridor to a vast bedroom. It was lavish, decorated in deep, rich tones, a stark contrast to her humble life. A plush velvet bed, a vanity, a dressing room, everything a woman could desire, yet it felt like a trap. "Your movements are restricted to this wing." His voice was low, resonating with a quiet power that brooked no argument. "You will not leave without an escort. All communication will be monitored. These are not requests, Diana. They are rules." She nodded, unable to speak, her throat tight with a fear so profound it bordered on reverence. He was a demanding master, his decisions absolute, immediate. She felt a profound disorientation, as if the ground beneath her had vanished, leaving her suspended in his terrifying, all-encompassing control. As he turned to leave, his hand paused, withdrawing a small, dark velvet box from his pocket. He opened it, revealing a delicate choker of dark, almost black velvet, simple and elegant. He didn't offer it. He simply held it out. "This," he said, his eyes dark and unreadable meeting hers, "is yours." Diana reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing the soft fabric. It was beautiful, but she knew its true meaning. It was not jewelry. It was a symbol, a visible mark of his claim. He placed it carefully into her palm, his touch brief, impersonal, yet it sent a shiver through her. She felt its weight, light as a feather, yet heavy with unspoken possession. A velvet collar, not a physical restraint, but a powerful, psychological one. It was a constant reminder of where she belonged, to whom she belonged. That first night, alone in the opulent room, the silence of the mansion pressed in on her. She heard the soft, almost imperceptible shifts outside her door, the quiet tread of footsteps, the low murmurs. "Killers," he had said, stationed outside her bedroom door. The terror was overwhelming, a cold knot in her stomach. Yet beneath the fear, a strange, unsettling sensation began to seep through. It was safety. The same men who might scare her senseless were also the impenetrable shield against the world that had tried to consume her. She was caged, yes, but the cage was iron strong. No one else would touch her. No one else would dare. The thought was both terrifying and, in a twisted, desperate way, profoundly comforting. She was his, and what was his he protected with a brutal, unyielding ferocity. For the first time in her life, the fear of the outside world, of her father's debts and desperate men, had vanished. Now, there was only the fear of him and the strange, undeniable sense of peace that came with knowing she was utterly, completely under his protection. The gilded cage, she realized, was also a sanctuary. Colethorne's presence in the mansion was a constant, demanding force, an invisible weight that pressed down on Diana even when he wasn't in the room. But he was often in her space, not to charm or converse, but to observe, to assess. He would appear without warning, a silent, imposing figure in the doorway of her vast bedroom or the opulent sitting room assigned to her. She never heard him approach, she simply felt the shift in the air, the sudden drop in temperature, before she would look up and find his dark eyes fixed on her. He watched her eat, a silent sentinel across the long dining table, his gaze unyielding as she picked at the gourmet food she had no appetite for. He watched her move, her every gesture, every nervous twitch, seemingly catalogued and understood. She felt utterly exposed under that unwavering gaze, like a specimen under a microscope. Yet he rarely spoke, and when he did, it was usually a single word, a curt command, or a question that brooked no hesitation. Among the stark grandeur of her temporary prison, one small splash of color remained from her old life. She had somehow managed to keep a wilting bouquet of white lilies from the shop, a fragile memory of home. Now, she spent hours carefully tending to them, pruning the browning leaves, refreshing the water, a defiant act of gentleness in his harsh world. One afternoon, as she painstakingly removed a faded petal, Cole appeared. He stood in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the polished wood, watching her. She felt her hands tremble, but she forced herself to continue, unwilling to surrender this tiny piece of herself. He said nothing, yet she felt his intense focus. After a long, unnerving moment, he simply turned and left. It was an allowance, she realized, a strange concession that hinted at a subtle, almost unsettling fascination with her vulnerability, her quiet resilience. The mansion itself was a stark contrast to her soft nature. Its stone walls and polished surfaces spoke of power, of secrets hidden within its depths. She sometimes heard faint, rhythmic thuds echoing from below, a low vibration in the floorboards that hinted at the underground fight tunnels Cole Thorne controlled. It was a brutal empire built on strength and ruthlessness, and she, a gentle florist, struggled to comprehend its scope. The sheer difference between his world and hers was a chasm she could never hope to bridge. Yet as the days bled into weeks, a strange shift occurred within her. Her initial terror of Cole Thorne, while still present, began to intertwine with an undeniable, unyielding sense of protection. He was cold, yes, and terrifyingly possessive, but his protectiveness was absolute. No one bothered her. No one threatened her. The fear that had plagued her for years, the constant dread of her father's creditors, of the dangerous men who sought to claim her, had vanished. The outside world, once a source of constant anxiety, was now a distant, harmless hum beyond the mansion's fortified walls. She was safe, truly safe, for the first time in her life. The realization was both profoundly unsettling and deeply comforting. The master of her safety, the man who had bought her, who caged her, was also the very man who terrified her most. But he was her terror, and his strength, his absolute control, meant that no other fear could touch her. It was a paradox, a gilded cage that was also an impenetrable shield. And in the unsettling quiet of her new life, Diana began to notice that her heart, though still wary, was slowly, reluctantly, finding a strange, almost addictive peace in the terrifying strength of his unwavering protection. Within the gilded cage of Cole Thorne's mansion, Diana found a strange truth emerging. He was her captor, her owner, the terrifying force that had uprooted her life. Yet in his own way, he ensured her comfort and well-being. Fine clothes, silks, and soft cashmeres in colors she would never have chosen for herself appeared in her dressing room. Gourmet meals, rich and exquisitely prepared, were laid before her, a stark contrast to the simple, often hurried food she used to eat. But it was always a provision, never a choice. Every luxury, every comfort, came with the silent, unspoken message of ownership, a constant reminder that these were benefits of being his. She had no decisions to make, no bills to worry about, no looming threats to dread. Cole's absolute authority, his silent, unwavering command over her new world, was a heavy cloak, but it also shielded her. The burden of choice, of navigating a treacherous world she never understood, had been lifted from her shoulders. She was confined, yes, but also utterly unburdened. The strange, unsettling comfort of his control began to seep into her bones, a quiet, almost addictive release from the constant fear that had shadowed her life before him. She often found herself watching him from a distance, observing his effortless control over his vast household. She saw his men, hardened and dangerous, move with quiet efficiency at his merest glance, a subtle shift in his posture, a low murmur of his voice. He commanded not with shouts or grand gestures, but with an intrinsic power that resonated through the very air he breathed. The sheer, overwhelming force he wielded, the way entire operations seemed to bend to his will, was a terrifying spectacle. It made her realize the utter futility of resistance. How could she, a small, fragile florist, possibly stand against such an immovable force? And so, gradually, a quiet yielding began. Not a defeat, but a deep, almost involuntary acceptance. Her body learned to follow his commands without thought, her mind to anticipate his subtle desires. It was a surrender not born of weakness, but of the overwhelming strength she perceived in him, a strength that promised absolute protection. One afternoon, a surprising event unfolded. Cole found her tracing patterns on a dusty window pane in an unused conservatory, her fingers aching for the feel of soil and living things. She hadn't realized he was there until his deep voice, low and resonant, broke the silence. "You miss your flowers." It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. Diana turned, her heart thrumming. He stood in the doorway, immense and unyielding, his eyes, as always, unreadable. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He simply nodded, then turned to one of his men. A curt command, a few quiet words she couldn't quite catch. Later that day, she was led to a small, neglected greenhouse tucked away behind the main mansion, its glass panes grimy, its interior filled with forgotten pots and withered plants. It was a ruin, but to Diana, it was a glimpse of heaven. "This is yours now," Cole said, appearing behind her, his voice making her jump. He held out a small, ornate brass key, its metal glinting in the weak winter light. "Tend to it as you wish." Diana reached for it, her fingers trembling as they closed around the cold metal. It was a small act, yet profoundly significant. He was giving her something back, a purpose, a connection to the life she had lost. But as her gaze met his, she knew its true meaning. It was his to give, his to take. The key was a privilege, not a freedom. It reminded her that even this small corner of peace, this fragile hope, was entirely at his discretion. Yet as she clutched the key, a strange, almost fragile sense of belonging began to form within her. He had seen a need, and he had met it, in his own cold, possessive way. She was his, undeniably, absolutely. And for the first time she felt not just safe, but almost cared for. The greenhouse, a place of growth and life, became a symbol of her new existence, cultivated under his watchful eye, existing only because he allowed it, a testament to the powerful, unsettling comfort of his command. The fragile peace Diana had found in the greenhouse shattered with a sound as delicate as breaking glass. She was among her roses, the rich scent of earth and bloom, a balm to her weary soul, when a distant, muffled shout echoed from the main house. It was quickly followed by hushed, urgent voices, their tone unlike the quiet professionalism she had grown accustomed to. A knot tightened in her stomach. She moved silently to the greenhouse door, pressing her ear against the cool wood. Fragments of conversation, sharp and alarming, drifted through. "Retaliation? Thorn stole her?" The words were like shards of ice, piercing her fragile sense of security. She heard the name Thorn repeated, always with a tone of grim determination. "They want her back." Her breath caught. Her. They wanted her back. The human trafficking ring, the predatory men her father had tried to sell her to, they hadn't simply vanished. Cole's intervention, his violent claim, had not ended the threat. It had merely redirected it. She was no longer a debt but a stolen prize, and the original owners were furious. The next few days were a blur of heightened tension within the mansion. The silent, watchful men who guarded her seemed even more vigilant, their gazes sharper, their movements more purposeful. She saw them huddled in small groups, their voices low and intense, their hands often resting on the weapons concealed beneath their jackets. The quiet hum of the mansion, once oppressive, now felt like the tense silence before a storm. She caught glimpses of Cole himself, and the change in him was immediate and stark. His face, usually an impassive mask, was harder, etched with a grim resolve that sent a shiver down her spine. His dark eyes, always intense, now held an almost predatory gleam, constantly scanning, assessing. He moved with a coiled energy, a dangerous predator preparing for battle. His commands, usually delivered in a low, resonant tone, were now sharper, clipped, imbued with an unyielding authority that brooked no delay or question. She watched him speak into a phone, his voice a low growl, his jaw clenched, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the conflict was escalating. Diana retreated deeper into herself, spending more time in the greenhouse, trying to find solace among her plants. But even there, the whispers of retaliation followed her, carried on the frigid winter wind. She understood now, with a chilling clarity, that the safety she had found in Cole Thorne's mansion was not absolute. It was a bubble, meticulously crafted and ferociously defended by him, but a bubble nonetheless, floating precariously in a sea of danger. He was a shield, yes, but he was also the magnet drawing the bullets. The threat was no longer abstract. It wasn't just her father's gambling mess or faceless creditors. This was personal. This was a direct consequence of her father's desperate actions and Cole's even more desperate, brutal intervention. She was the spark that had ignited this war, the central point around which all this violence revolved. The thought made her stomach churn with a sickening mix of fear and guilt. She remembered Cole's words in the warehouse, his resonant declaration, "She belongs to me now. Anyone who touches what's mine will die screaming." At the time, they had been terrifying, yet also strangely comforting, warding off the immediate threat. Now she understood the double edge of that statement. By claiming her, he had not just protected her, he had also branded her, making her a symbol of defiance against powerful, ruthless men. She was the prize. She was the reason. And as the mansion tightened its defenses, as Cole Thorne's presence grew more formidable and dangerous, Diana felt a profound sense of dread. Her quiet life, her dreams of flowers, felt impossibly distant. She was trapped in a war she hadn't started, a war fought over her by a man who owned her and whose terrifying protection was now the only thing standing between her and a fate far worse than death. The gilded cage was now a fortress, and she, its most valuable, most vulnerable, captive. The mansion, once a place of intimidating grandeur, now transformed into an impenetrable fortress. The subtle hum of heightened security was everywhere, a constant, low thrum beneath the polished floors and behind the heavy tapestries. Diana felt it in the way the air grew heavier, in the way the silence seemed to absorb every sound. The iron gate, emblazoned with Cole Thorne's crest, once merely imposing, now felt like a formidable barrier, reinforced and unyielding, its dark metal gleaming under the harsh security lights that now pierced the swirling snow. Every window, every door, every hidden passage seemed to be under an unblinking, constant watch. Cole Thorne himself was the architect of this transformation. He moved through his domain with an even greater sense of purpose, his presence a palpable force of command. He summoned Diana to his study one evening, a vast room with dark wood and shelves filled with unreadable books. The air thick with the scent of old leather and his own potent authority. He stood before her, immense and unyielding, his dark eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "You will not leave this wing of the mansion under any circumstances." His voice was low, firm, leaving no room for question. "If an alarm sounds, you will immediately proceed to the designated safe room." He gestured vaguely to a hidden door she hadn't noticed before, camouflaged within the ornate paneling. "You will not open it for anyone but me. Understood?" Diana nodded, her throat tight. His words were not suggestions. They were non-negotiable instructions, delivered with the absolute certainty of a man whose commands were law. She felt a knot of fear in her stomach, but also a strange, almost dizzying sense of clarity. Every decision, every movement was now dictated by him for her safety. It was a deeper imprisonment, a tightening of the gilded cage, yet she knew with a chilling certainty that it was for her own good. She watched his men patrol the corridors, their footsteps hushed, their faces grim. They were armed, vigilant, their eyes constantly scanning, their hands never far from the weapons concealed beneath their jackets. The air was charged with an unspoken tension, a readiness for conflict that made her heart pound. She saw the glint of steel, the focused intensity in their gazes, and she understood. The threat was real. The external danger was not a phantom, it was a hungry beast circling the fortress, and Cole Thorne was its only defense. Her fear of him, once a sharp, singular entity, now began to intertwine with a desperate, burgeoning trust. She had no choice. She was entirely at his mercy, utterly dependent on his strength, his ruthlessness, to keep the outside world at bay. The tension she felt was no longer about fighting him, but about the terrifying external forces trying to break through his defenses, trying to reach her. She watched him from her window, a silent observer as he barked orders to his men in the snow-covered courtyard. He was a force of nature, a dark, dangerous storm against the white landscape. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her presence, but every command he issued, every strategic placement of his men, was ultimately for her. He was building an impenetrable wall around her, a shield against the violence he had unleashed by claiming her. It was a strange paradox. She was more confined than ever, her world shrinking to the confines of this fortified wing. But for the first time, she felt an absolute certainty that no harm would come to her from outside. The fear of the unknown, of the predatory men who sought to reclaim her, was replaced by a singular, all-consuming reliance on Cole Thorne. She was his captive, yes, but she was also his most fiercely protected possession. And in the unsettling quiet of the fortress, Diana found herself clinging to the terrifying strength of his command, knowing that her very life depended on it. The fortress that was Cole Thorne's mansion felt eerily quiet without him. The air, usually thick with his commanding presence, now seemed thin, almost hollow. Diana had grown accustomed to the subtle weight of his gaze, the low resonance of his voice, even the distant thrum of his power permeating the stone walls. Now his absence was a gaping void, leaving her feeling exposed in a way the constant guards could not alleviate. The conflict, she realized, had broadened beyond the initial skirmish with the trafficking ring. She overheard snippets of urgent conversations from the ever-present guards, words like new players and rival cartel, whispered with grim faces. They spoke of retribution, of a formidable entity now drawn into the escalating war, eager to claim what Cole Thorne had dared to steal. She heard his name, Thorne Devil, spoken with a mixture of fear and grudging respect, even by those who sought to challenge him. The whispers chilled her, reminding her that she was the center of this storm, the object of a dangerous, violent tug-of-war. Cole was increasingly absent, leaving the mansion to deal with the rising threats. He would disappear for hours, sometimes an entire day, his departures as sudden and unannounced as his arrivals. When he was there, his focus was entirely on neutralizing the external forces. He spent long hours in his study, the heavy oak door always closed, conferring with his lieutenants in low, urgent tones. His face, when she caught a glimpse of it, was a mask of cold fury, his dark eyes burning with an almost terrifying resolve. He was a general at war, and she, his most valuable asset, was left behind in the heavily guarded stronghold. Diana was isolated, confined to her wing, surrounded by vigilant men who protected her from the outside, but offered no comfort or company. She wandered the opulent rooms, her footsteps echoing in the silence, the sheer grandeur of the mansion feeling more like a cage than ever. She would sit by the window, watching the snow fall, seeing nothing but the swirling white blur that separated her from the world, and from him. Her survival, she understood with a chilling clarity, depended solely on his strength, on his ability to crush those who sought to reclaim her. The fear that had once been purely directed at Cole himself now fractured, splitting into a raw, pervasive terror of what might happen if he failed, if he didn't return. The thought of being left to the mercy of those other unseen men, those who called him devil and saw her as a prize, was a dread far deeper than anything she had ever felt under his roof. And then, as the days of his absence stretched into a strange eternity, a new, unsettling emotion began to surface within her. It started as a subtle unease, a gnawing emptiness. She found herself scanning the corridors, listening for the distinctive heavy tread of his boots, the low, powerful resonance of his voice that somehow made the world feel solid again. She missed his imposing presence, the sheer, overwhelming force of him that had become her anchor in this tumultuous new life. It was a strange, almost shameful longing. She was still terrified of him, of his absolute power, of the brutal world he inhabited. But that terror was now intertwined with a desperate, burgeoning need for his protection. She yearned for the return of her terrifying master, the man who had claimed her with a brutal thumbprint and promised violence to any who dared touch what was his. His absence was a constant reminder of the external threats, and his return, she realized, would be the only true sign that she was safe. She needed his darkness to shield her from a darker world, needed his command to give her a purpose, needed his possessive strength to simply exist. The fortress was impenetrable, but without its king, Diana felt impossibly vulnerable, silently aching for the return of her monster. The mansion's heavy silence pressed in on Diana, a physical weight in Cole Thorne's continued absence. The whispers of a wider war, of a rival cartel, and the Thorne Devil echoed in her mind, amplifying her gnawing anxiety. She felt like a pawn on a giant, brutal chessboard, moved by forces far beyond her comprehension. Restless, she wandered through the grand, empty rooms, her footsteps soft against the marble, a stark contrast to the thrumming tension outside the fortress walls. One afternoon, seeking distraction from her swirling fears, Diana found herself in a small, seldom-used sitting room adjacent to Cole's private study. She had never dared to venture into his actual workspace, but this antechamber held a forgotten bookshelf filled with old, leather-bound tomes. As she reached for a heavy volume, a loose paper slipped from between its pages, fluttering to the floor. She bent to pick it up, her fingers brushing against the crisp parchment. It was a formal document, a contract of sorts, but the words that jumped out at her were handwritten. Scrawled in her father's frantic script, her blood ran cold. It was another IOU, but this one contained a chilling detail, not just her name, but another, Lily Mercer, her younger sister, a child. Diana's breath hitched, a strangled sound caught in her throat. She read it again, her eyes blurring. Her father hadn't just sold her, he had promised Lily too. A child barely old enough to understand the horrors of such a transaction, to the very same traffickers. The world tilted on its axis. Her father, the man she had loved despite his flaws, was a monster, a true, unforgivable monster. The betrayal was so profound, so utterly devastating, that she felt a physical pain, a cold, crushing weight in her chest. All this time, she had only considered her own fate, her own impending doom. To think of Lily, sweet, innocent Lily, dragged into this nightmare, made her stomach churn with a sickening wave of horror. A shadow fell over her. Diana didn't need to look up. She felt the shift in the air, the sudden, potent presence that was undeniably Cole Thorne. He had returned. He stood above her, immense and unyielding. his dark eyes fixed on the paper clutched in her trembling hand. He didn't ask what she was doing. He simply knew. That's why I intervened when I did. His voice was low, devoid of emotion. A cold, flat statement. Your father was desperate. He was offering her to them as a down payment for future merchandise. Diana stared up at him, tears finally spilling, tracing hot paths down her cheeks. Lily? She choked out, the name a raw plea. You knew. Cole's gaze remained unyielding. I knew. He walked to a nearby armchair and settled into it, his posture radiating an almost casual yet absolute power. The initial deal was for both of you. I intercepted it, bought your contract, but your father had already made a separate arrangement for Lily, in thinking he could still clear some debt. He was going to sell her to a different faction of the same ring, weeks later. He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. I pulled her out of her school, placed her in a hidden safe house upstate. The first group sent to collect her never made it back. I took the blame for the massacre. His voice was chillingly calm, as if discussing a mundane business transaction. It ensured your sister's name, and by extension yours, would never appear on police or cartel records. They think I simply eliminated a rival operation. They don't know she exists now, not to them. The words hit Diana with the force of a physical blow. Her father's betrayal was deeper, uglier than she could have ever imagined. But Cole's actions, they were monstrous in their own right, yet utterly, undeniably protective. He had known, he had acted, he had slaughtered men, taken responsibility for their deaths, all to ensure that her younger sister, her family, was safe. The horror was immense, an icy tendril wrapping around her heart. He was a killer, a brutal, ruthless man. But he had wielded that violence, that terrifying power, to shield the innocent, to save her and hers. Her perception of her father, already shattered, crumbled into dust. And her perception of Cole Thorne, the cruelest mafia lord, twisted into something else entirely. Her fear of him didn't vanish, but it morphed. It became a profound awe, a deep, reluctant, yet undeniable trust. He was capable of unimaginable violence, but he had directed it outward, a preemptive strike against a world that sought to harm what was his. She was his. Lily was now, by extension, his to protect. And in that terrifying, brutal truth, Diana found not just terror, but a shocking, absolute certainty of safety. He was a monster, yes, but he was her monster, and he had saved her sister. The weight of his power, once suffocating, now felt like an unshakable fortress, a shield he would use to burn the world down if it meant keeping her safe. The words Cole spoke, delivered with such chilling calm, ripped through Diana's world, leaving her utterly exposed and shattered. Her father's betrayal, once a gnawing dread, now solidified into a grotesque, unforgivable reality. He hadn't just sacrificed her. He had willingly offered up her innocent sister, a child, to the same monstrous fate. The sheer depravity of it made her stomach churn, a bitter taste rising in her throat. She looked at the crumpled IOU, then at Cole, the two stark truths colliding in her mind with devastating force. Her father was not just flawed, he was a monster, and Cole. He was a monster too, a brutal, ruthless man who had openly admitted to slaughtering men. Yet he had done so to save Lily. He had orchestrated a massacre, taken the blame, all to shield her sister from the very fate Diana had only just escaped. The horror of his methods was immense, a cold tendril of fear still coiling in her gut. But the truth of his protective nature, extending even to the family she thought lost, shook her to her core. She felt utterly overwhelmed, reeling from the twin blows of betrayal and brutal salvation. He was a killer, a dark force of nature, yet he was her killer, her dark force, one who had moved heaven and earth and spilled blood to protect what he now considered his own. Her breath hitched, a silent sob catching in her throat as she stared at the man who sat so impassively before her. His dark eyes held no apology, no remorse, only the unyielding certainty of his own power and purpose. The fear she felt for Cole Thorne had always been a sharp, singular terror, a constant companion since he had claimed her. But now, that fear began to warp, to twist into something profoundly different. It didn't vanish. How could it? He was still capable of unimaginable violence. Yet she now understood that violence was wielded with a terrifying precision, aimed exclusively at those who dared to threaten her and hers. He wasn't just a force of destruction, he was a shield forged in fire and blood, an impenetrable wall against a world far more cruel than even she had imagined. A profound awe settled over her, a reluctant yet undeniable trust blooming in the wreckage of her former life. She saw the true scope of his power, not just in wealth or influence, but in his absolute unyielding devotion to what he considered his own. He was a predator, yes, but she was under his wing, a cherished, fiercely guarded part of his dark empire. The men he had slaughtered were a testament to that devotion, a brutal, bloody promise that no one, absolutely no one, would touch what belonged to Cole Thorne. Her initial terror of him, the sheer dread of his presence, now morphed into a deeper, more complex emotion. It was still fear, a respectful, almost reverent fear of a force she could never comprehend, let alone challenge. But intertwined with it was a strange, undeniable sense of profound safety. For the first time she felt truly, absolutely secure from the chaos and cruelty of the outside world. All the burdens, all the threats, all the impossible choices had been lifted from her. They were his to bear, his to crush. She felt a quiet yielding begin in her heart, a deep, instinctual surrender to his strength. Resistance was not only futile, it felt almost wrong. His command was absolute, and in that absoluteness lay an ultimate protection, a peace she had never known. She was his, undeniably. And by extending his terrifying protection to Lily, he had not just saved her sister. He had bound Diana to him with an invisible, unbreakable chain, forged in the fires of her father's betrayal and Cole's brutal, selfless devotion. Her breath came easier, a deep, shuddering inhale. The tears still flowed, but they were no longer just tears of terror or grief. They were also tears of a strange, unsettling relief, of a profound, almost primal acceptance. He was her monster, and she, his protected, belonged to him. The weight of his power, once suffocating, now felt like the strongest, most unshakable fortress, a truth she finally completely accepted. The silence of the mansion, once a source of oppressive calm, shattered with a terrifying immediacy. A distant crack, sharp and distinct, sliced through the winter air, quickly followed by another. Closer this time. And then a rapid succession that left no doubt. Gunshots. Real, terrifying gunshots, echoing not from far-off streets, but from the immediate vicinity of the mansion's fortified walls. Diana, who had been tending a fragile orchid in the greenhouse, dropped her watering can with a clatter, her heart leaping into her throat. A primal scream of an alarm. A piercing siren she had only heard during drills, ripped through the air, vibrating through the very stone beneath her feet. The mansion, her supposed sanctuary, was under attack. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her, threatening to consume her. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, but she had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. Then, a presence, swift and overwhelming, filled the greenhouse. Cole Thorne. He was no longer the silent observer, the distant master. He was a whirlwind of command, a force of brutal efficiency. His dark eyes, usually unreadable, blazed with a terrifying intensity, focused, lethal. He didn't speak. Not yet, but his gaze swept over her, a quick, possessive assessment that somehow steadied her trembling limbs. He barked orders into a comms device clipped to his ear, his voice low and guttural, a stark contrast to the piercing alarm. His men, who had seemed so quiet and disciplined before, now moved with a savage, focused energy, appearing from hidden passages, weapons drawn. They were soldiers, and their lord was their general. Cole moved towards Diana with a terrifying speed, his large hand clamping firmly around her arm. It wasn't gentle, but it wasn't painful either. It was a grip of absolute possession, pulling her along, guiding her through the chaos. "Stay low," he commanded, his voice a growl that cut through the cacophony of the alarms and distant gunfire. "Don't question. Don't look back." She stumbled, her legs suddenly weak, but his grip was unyielding. Propelling her forward, she didn't question. She simply obeyed. Her mind, usually so prone to overthinking, went blank, leaving only the instinct to follow him, to cling to his strength. He pulled her out of the greenhouse, through a series of service corridors she had never seen, down into the deeper, more secure parts of the mansion. Gunshots now echoed closer, their impact vibrating through the walls. She heard shouts, the clash of bodies, the brutal symphony of a battle unfolding just beyond their immediate path. Fear, a cold, sickening wave, threatened to overwhelm her. But then she felt Cole's body, solid and unyielding, moving between her and the source of the sounds. He wasn't just guiding her, he was shielding her. His broad back, his powerful shoulders became a wall, a barrier against the violence that raged outside. He shoved her into a small, windowless room, its walls made of reinforced concrete, a heavy steel door already ajar. This was the safe room he had spoken of. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice curt, devoid of emotion, yet laced with an undeniable urgency that compelled absolute compliance. "Don't move. Don't make a sound." He didn't wait for her to acknowledge. He simply pushed her inside, his body momentarily blocking the doorway, then pulled the heavy door almost shut, leaving only a sliver of space. Through that narrow gap, Diana watched him. He was a force of nature, radiating controlled fury. He turned, his hand already on the grip of a weapon she hadn't seen him draw, his eyes scanning the corridor with predatory focus. He was a monster, yes, but he was her monster. He was out there, in the thick of the brutal, bloody war he had ignited by claiming her, fighting to protect her. She saw his ruthlessness, the cold, calculating efficiency with which he prepared to face down the men who sought to breach his fortress, to harm what was his. The violence was terrifying, but she was shielded by his strength, by his presence, even as he moved away from her, towards the danger. She didn't fight him, didn't argue. She huddled in the corner of the small room, her arms wrapped around herself, but her eyes fixed on the sliver of light from the crack in the door. He was her anchor in this storm, her belief in his strength absolute. If he told her to stay, she would stay. If he told her to hide, she would hide. Her very survival, she knew, depended on her absolute, unquestioning submission to his every command. And in that terrifying, brutal moment, she felt a strange, profound peace in the knowledge that she was utterly, completely under his protection. The heavy steel door of the safe room, left ajar by a sliver, offered Diana a narrow glimpse of the corridor. The sounds of battle had diminished, replaced by a tense, eerie quiet. She heard hushed voices, the dragging of heavy objects, and then the distinct, heavy tread of Colethorn's boots moving away, not towards her, but further down the passage, towards the mansion's main exit. Her breath hitched. He was leaving. A few minutes later, the sliver of light vanished as the door was gently, firmly, pushed shut from the outside. The click of the lock, soft but definitive, echoed in the small, windowless space. She was truly alone now, encased in concrete, protected from the immediate danger, but acutely aware of the greater unseen storm raging beyond her walls. A low, calm voice spoke through the intercom system embedded in the wall. "Lady Diana, Lord Thorn has departed to address the remaining threats. You are secure. We await his return." The voice was devoid of emotion, a simple statement of fact. Cole had gone. He was out there, in the bitter Chicago night, facing the very men who had dared to breach his fortress, who sought to reclaim her. Diana pictured him, a dark, unstoppable force, moving through the snow-laden streets, his eyes burning with cold resolve. He wasn't just fighting. He was making a statement. A brutal, public declaration to anyone who dared to challenge him, to anyone who dared to touch what was his. He was going to decimate them, not just defeat, but utterly crush. A key faction of the rival cartel and the trafficking ring. It was a terrifying thought, but one that resonated with the absolute power she knew he possessed. This wasn't merely a skirmish. It was an act of ruthless, calculated vengeance, designed to end the war he had started by claiming her. Left in the guarded silence of the mansion, Diana felt a profound sense of isolation. The constant presence of his men, vigilant and armed, was a stark reminder of the danger. Yet without Cole himself, the fortress felt less impenetrable, less safe. His absence was a heavy weight, a gaping hole in the sense of order that had, paradoxically, settled over her life under his rule. She was still protected, still watched over, but the ultimate shield, the immovable force, was no longer physically present. Her thoughts spiraled, a mix of apprehension and a strange, unsettling longing. She feared what he was doing, the violence he was undoubtedly inflicting, the blood that would surely be spilled. But she also understood, with a chilling clarity, that this was necessary. This was the terrifying cost of her safety, the brutal price of belonging to a man like Cole Thorne. He was out there, fighting for her, ensuring that no one would ever again dare to threaten her or her sister. She paced the small room, her quiet hope and burgeoning devotion the only anchors in the swirling chaos. She didn't know how long he would be gone, but every tick of the clock felt like an eternity. She pictured his face, hard and unyielding, his powerful hands, capable of both brutal force and the surprising, almost gentle act of giving her the greenhouse key. He was a monster, yes, but he was her monster, and his ferocity was now her ultimate protection, her survival. Her very existence in this new, terrifying world depended entirely on his strength, on his return. She needed him. The realization was stark, raw, and undeniable. She needed his darkness to shield her from a darker world, needed his command to give her a purpose, needed his possessive strength to simply exist. The silence of the safe room pressed in, but her mind echoed with a single, desperate prayer for his swift and victorious return. His presence meant safety, meant order, meant the continuation of her life under his absolute, terrifying rule. She waited, acutely aware that her ultimate safety lay not in the walls around her, but in the monstrous resolve of the man who had claimed her as his own. The blizzard howled, a banshee's shriek tearing through the Chicago night, rattling the ancient stone of Thorne's mansion. Snow, thick and blinding, swirled like a furious white curtain, muffling the world outside, yet amplifying the terrifying sounds within. Diana had been in the greenhouse, trying to find a fragile solace among her still-growing roses, when the first impact struck. A deafening crash, the roar of splintering wood and shattering glass, ripped through the air, vibrating through the very earth beneath her feet. The mansion's defenses, once thought impregnable, had been breached. Then came the shouts, raw and guttural, unlike the disciplined commands of Cole's men. These were voices filled with rage and desperation, the triumphant cries of men who believed they were reclaiming what was theirs. The human trafficking ring, those monstrous figures from her past, had finally found a way in, using the blizzard's fury as their cover. Panic, cold and visceral, seized Diana, threatening to overwhelm her. Her greenhouse, her small, cherished sanctuary, suddenly felt like a fragile shell about to implode. A shadow fell over her, immense and unyielding. Cole Thorne. He was there, a dark, formidable presence, his face grim, his eyes burning with a terrifying primal fury that made her breath catch. He didn't speak, not immediately. His hand, large and strong, clamped around her wrist, his grip absolute, possessive, a silent command that brooked no argument. He moved with a swift, predatory grace, pulling her from the heart of the greenhouse, away from the main door that now groaned under renewed assault. "Stay close," he growled, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her, cutting through the rising cacophony of breaking glass and distant gunfire. "Stay low." He didn't wait for her to respond, didn't need her consent. He simply pulled, guiding her with an irresistible force deeper into the lush, glass-walled space. This was his most treasured and protected space, the one place he had allowed her to cultivate a semblance of her old life. Now, he was preparing to turn it into a battlefield. Diana stumbled, her legs feeling like water, but his grip was her anchor, his powerful body a shield. She didn't question, didn't resist. Her mind, usually so prone to desperate thought, went blank, leaving only the instinct to obey, to cling to the terrifying strength that pulled her forward. She felt a strange, dizzying mix of utter terror and an almost intoxicating sense of safety. He was a monster, yes, but he was her monster, and he was here, protecting her. He shoved her gently behind a thick cluster of towering potted palms, their broad leaves offering a fragile concealment. "Don't move," he commanded, his eyes dark and intense, piercing through her. "Don't make a sound." His words were sharp, possessive, a final instruction for her survival. Then, with a speed that defied his size, he knelt, his fingers working at a discreet panel hidden in the polished marble floor. It slid open silently, revealing a hidden cache within the earth, glinting metal, the dark gleam of weapons she didn't recognize. Even here in his sanctuary, he was always ready, always prepared. He pulled out two sleek, dark firearms, checking their magazines with practiced ease. His movements were fluid, precise, imbued with a lethal grace that belonged to a man intimately familiar with violence. He looked up at her, his dark eyes momentarily softening, or perhaps it was just the reflection of the distant mansion lights. "You are mine," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, yet resonating with an absolute, undeniable claim, "and no one touches what's mine." Her terror was immense, but his command was an anchor in the storm, a solid, unyielding point in a world that was shattering around her. She watched him, mesmerized by his transformation from silent master to primal protector. The lush, beautiful greenhouse, filled with the scent of damp earth and blooming life, was about to become a place of death, but she knew, with a terrifying, absolute certainty, that he would protect her. He was preparing to fight for her, to kill for her, and in that brutal, possessive devotion, Diana felt not just fear, but a profound, almost addictive sense of belonging. His strength was her shield, his command her ultimate safety. She huddled behind the palms, her gaze fixed on his broad, unyielding back, ready to witness the monster fight for what was his. The glass walls of the greenhouse exploded inward, a deafening symphony of shattering panes and splintering wood that ripped through the blizzard's shriek. Men, dark figures silhouetted against the swirling white, poured through the gaping holes, their shouts raw with triumph and their guns already raised. Diana, still pressed behind the broad leaves of the potted palms, felt the impact vibrate through her very bones. Her breath caught, a silent scream dying in her throat as a hail of glass rained down, sparkling like deadly diamonds around her. Pure, unadulterated terror seized her, a cold, paralyzing grip. Then Cole Thorne moved. He was no longer a man. He was a primal force, a blur of controlled fury amidst the chaos. He didn't hesitate, didn't flinch. The sleek, dark firearms he had retrieved from the hidden cache were already in his hands, spitting fire and thunder. The greenhouse, once a sanctuary of green life, transformed into a brutal battlefield. He beat, he shot, he moved with a savage grace Diana could barely comprehend. Pots shattered, sending soil and ceramic flying. Exotic plants, moments ago vibrant, were torn apart, their leaves shredded by bullets, their delicate blooms crushed underfoot. Every grunt of effort, every explosive report of his weapons resonated with a terrifying, absolute resolve. He was a whirlwind of motion, a dark, unyielding storm against the pale, desperate figures of the traffickers. A searing heat grazed Diana's arm as a bullet whizzed past, embedding itself with a thud in the wall behind her. Before she could even process the shock, Cole was there, a solid, immovable mass. He didn't speak, but his large hand clamped over her head, pushing her down, pressing her face against the damp earth of her overturned pot. His body, immense and unyielding, covered hers, shielding her completely from the raining glass and the deadly exchange of gunfire. She could feel the hard muscle of his back, the tense coil of his shoulders, the furious thrum of his heartbeat against her own racing pulse. The sounds of battle were still all around them, terrifyingly close, but against his body, pinned beneath his protective weight, Diana felt an almost dizzying sense of absolute safety. He was a monster, but he was her monster, and he was taking every bullet, every blow, to keep her alive. Through the chaos, a section of the greenhouse's front door, already weakened, finally gave way, hanging open like a broken jaw. Beyond it, the blizzard raged, a curtain of white, but it was also a clear, desperate path to escape. Freedom, a chance to run, to vanish into the storm, to leave this brutal world and this terrifying man behind. She saw it, a stark, undeniable invitation. For a fleeting second, her mind screamed at her to move, to crawl, to push away from the crushing weight of his protection and flee. But her eyes, pressed against his bloodied shirt, were fixed not on the open door, but on him. She watched him even as he grunted with effort, even as the scent of powder and his own sweat filled her nostrils. He was bleeding, a dark stain spreading across the fabric near his shoulder, but his movements were relentless, his focus unwavering. His ruthlessness was terrifying, a cold, brutal efficiency that saw only threats, only targets. Yet every violent act, every bone-jarring blow was for her. He was a man consumed by the need to protect what was his, and she was his. The choice, so clear moments ago, evaporated. Running meant exposing herself to the world outside, to the unknown, to a fate far worse than even this terrifying moment. Running meant abandoning the only true shield she had ever known. His power, his dominance, his sheer, unyielding will to protect her was not a cage, it was an anchor. Her fingers, still trembling, uncurled from the cold earth and clutched his bloodied shirt, gripping the fabric as if her life depended on it. She pressed her face harder against his back, feeling the vibrations of his furious breathing, the raw power of him. Through the sounds of the dying battle, through the ringing in her ears, a choked whisper escaped her lips, a truth that had been forged in fire and glass and blood. I choose to belong to you. It was a surrender, absolute and complete, a choice made not from fear of him, but from the profound, undeniable safety found only in his terrifying, possessive strength. The blizzard's roar had begun to fade, replaced by a chilling silence that pressed in on the shattered greenhouse. The last of the attackers lay still, amidst the ruin of shattered pots and shredded leaves, their desperate, hateful energy finally extinguished. Cole Thorne, still covering Diana with his body, slowly shifted, the tension in his powerful frame gradually receding. His breathing, once ragged with exertion and fury, began to even out, though a low, guttural growl still vibrated deep in his chest. Diana, pinned beneath him, could feel the sticky warmth of his blood on her cheek, the scent of iron and gunpowder sharp in the air. The raw, primal terror that had gripped her slowly loosened its hold, replaced by a profound, almost dizzying sense of awe. He had fought for her, a terrifying, unstoppable force of nature, and he had won. The monster had protected his prize. He pushed himself up, his movements stiff, his broad shoulders slumping slightly. Diana watched, mesmerized, as the battle-hardened ferocity slowly receded from his features, leaving behind a grim exhaustion. He was injured. A dark, spreading stain on his shoulder, and a deep gash weeping blood near his temple. But his eyes, when they finally met hers, were no longer blazing with lethal intent. They were dark, intense, but held a strange, almost tender softness she had never seen before. It was a possessive tenderness, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond forged in blood and shattered glass. He reached out a large hand, his fingers, still smudged with dirt and blood, gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. His touch, for the first time, held no threat, only an overwhelming sense of claim and protection. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough, a low rumble, but the edge of command was gone, replaced by a deeper concern that startled her. Diana shook her head, her voice a raw whisper. "No. You saved me." He nodded, accepting her words as simple fact. His gaze swept over the ruined greenhouse, a landscape of broken beauty, then returned to her. The space was devastated, a testament to the brutal violence that had just unfolded. Shattered glass crunched underfoot, upturned tables lay in splinters, and the delicate blooms she had nurtured were now trampled, stained with blood and soil. It was a ruin, yet their bond, forged in this very fire, felt irrevocably strong, absolute. Slowly, carefully, Diana pushed herself up. Her legs still trembled, but a new, quiet strength began to hum beneath her skin. Her fear of coal, once a consuming terror, had transformed. It wasn't gone entirely. How could it be? He was still the ruthless lord, capable of unimaginable violence. But now, that fear was inextricably entwined with an absolute trust, a profound acceptance. She moved towards him, her movements hesitant at first, then gaining a quiet resolve. "You're bleeding," she said, her voice steadier now. Her florist's hands, so accustomed to delicate tasks, reached out, not to flee, but to tend. She found a clean piece of linen from a nearby potting bench and gently, carefully, pressed it against the wound on his temple. He flinched slightly at her touch, a small, involuntary reaction, but he didn't pull away. He simply watched her, his dark eyes unwavering. She looked into his eyes, seeing her own reflection in their depths, a woman irrevocably changed. The girl who had cowered in fear was gone. In her place was a woman who had chosen to belong, who understood the terrifying beauty of his absolute power and the ultimate safety it offered. She was his, undeniably. And in that complete acceptance, she found not just peace, but a strange, unyielding sense of purpose. His ferocity had receded, but his power remained, an immense, silent force. He was still the feared lord, but for her, in this moment he was simply her protector, wounded and victorious. She was no longer just safe, she was his. And in that terrifying, beautiful truth, a deep, powerful acceptance of her place by his side settled over her, warm and solid, an anchor in the storm-tossed wreckage of her world. Years later, the glass-walled greenhouse stood not just restored, but transformed. The scars of that brutal night were gone, replaced by vibrant life, a lush, verdant paradise brimming with roses in every shade, lilies unfurling their delicate petals, and exotic orchids blooming in profusion. Yet, beneath the beauty, a new layer had been seamlessly woven into its very structure. Hidden panels in the marble floor concealed not just gardening tools, but sleek, dark weapons. Discreetly integrated into the stone walls were panic rooms, their steel doors camouflaged by climbing vines, a testament to the enduring reality of their world. It was a sanctuary, yes, but one built on the foundations of a fortress, A paradox of beauty and brutal necessity, Diana, now his wife, moved through the fragrant air, her touch gentle as she tended to her blooms. Her fingers, once trembling with fear, now moved with a quiet confidence, pruning a wayward stem, misting the dewy leaves. She wore simple, elegant clothes, her hair often adorned with a fresh flower, a soft contrast to the stark power that permeated the mansion. The fragile florist who had once cowered in terror was gone, replaced by a woman who radiated a deep, unshakable serenity. Her eyes, no longer shadowed by fear, held a quiet strength, a protected peace that came from absolute certainty. She was safe, utterly and completely, cherished in a way she had never dared to dream. Outside the mansion's fortified walls, Colethorn's name had become synonymous with terror along the snow-laden lakeshore. His legend grew darker with each passing year, a whispered warning in the city's underbelly, a chilling promise of brutal retribution for any who dared to cross him. He was still the unyielding force of nature, the feared head of Chicago's most brutal crime syndicate. He still broke bones without blinking, his ruthlessness as sharp and precise as ever, his decisions absolute, his power undeniable. But within the quiet sanctity of their home, in the soft, fragrant air of the greenhouse, a different truth existed. Only his florist wife was allowed to wipe the blood from his knuckles, her delicate fingers tracing the scarred planes of his hands after a night of violence. Only she could look into his dark, unreadable eyes and find not just the monster, but the protector who had burned the world down for her. She would press her lips to his, a soft, tender kiss that seemed to cleanse the violence from his soul, a silent acknowledgement of the unbreakable bond forged in blood and fire. She was his, forever, his protected, his cherished, his anchor in a world of chaos. And under his powerful, possessive dominion, Diana found not just safety, but a profound, unyielding love. A peace that transcended the brutality, a quiet strength that bloomed eternally in the heart of her monster's empire. If you enjoyed this story, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe to Tales of Power and Desire to keep up with our intense romances.